Do we have an intangible self that's somehow separate from our body? What are the assumptions that have come to underpin our modern understanding of psychology? And is the soul just a relic of the past?
So, Allan, if you could start by introducing yourself to the viewers.
Well, my name is Allan Guggenbühl, and I'm a psychologist and psychotherapist. My background is actually Jungian, so I actually studied in the Jung Institute, and but I was also professor of education in Zurich, and I've written several books on several issues in psychology and conflict management and children.
Thank you. Well, you're excellently qualified to speak to us about what we need to speak about now, which is, there's one of the epoch-making moments in the history of the mind, and the Western conception of the self comes with the foundation of psychoanalysis. Can you start by talking about what was so dramatically new and different in Freud's way of understanding the human subject?
Well, actually, we have to understand also the circumstances when actually Freud started thinking of the unconscious and the superego and all these things, and also the role of sexuality. Actually, Freud actually, lived in a very interesting epoch. Actually, when there was a lot of the Industrial Revolution has been going on, and there was a lot of kind of belief in the mind, in consciousness, in feasibility, but everything started to crumble. But the Austrian Hungarian Empire started to collapse, and then one saw that something is changing. And I think Freud actually started to think of the role of the unconscious, because also the belief in feasibility, the belief in control through the mind started to be questioned. And that led to his idea that maybe something else is actually stronger and influences us. Maybe what we think we do and why we do things are not the real causes. Maybe the causes are somewhere else. And this is interesting because, this rational or kind of conscious way of thinking was actually done in order to kind of changing from the religious attitude. When you think of people before, it was actually God who actually decided on everything. It was religion. So actually, one had this idea, the mind had this idea, things are destinies and the world is actually defined by some other forces and God. But then at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, suddenly this idea of the mind, is actually the center, and that was actually questions. And I think that's what we have to think about. So Freud, as well as Adler and then Jung, they started to think, well, maybe there's other forces inside of us which we have to detect, and they're here, present, powerful, but not conscious.
And the Freudian schema, this division of the mind, can we see this as a way of kind of complicating Cartesian dualism by subdividing the mind itself?
Well, I think I would phrase it differently. I think, we human beings are, as we all know, rather complicated and difficult to understand human beings. And probably we never can understand us. But, understanding there's always a danger in understanding. Understanding, when we think we understand us, we know why we do this, we actually fail then to realize that there's maybe other forces, other elements, so understanding is a tricky term. And I think this is something which Freud realized. Searching for why we're influenced, searching, being curious about what is going on, that is actually more important. That's why interpretation is so important. To interpret something is more important. When you understood something, that's the end of actually the whole thinking process.
And can you talk a little bit about his subdivision of the mind into ego, id, and the unconscious and superego? Did it develop, or was there? What did it come, as it were, fully formed?
I think it was he quoted it from the system, the political system there, because they had censorship. In Austrian and Hungarian Empire, censorship, so certain things weren't allowed to be said and thought of, and certain things allowed. So this is actually super ego. So actually, he actually relied on that concept. And there was also a division in society. Society was very coded. Certain things were done and certain things were not done. And then there was a lot of things repressed, of course, sexuality and so. And I think it's a quotation from his society. So he actually took the model from the model of the society he lived in.
Yes. Now, I'm at pains to root the emergence of Freud's thinking in a very particular historical moment. And yet, when we think about Freud, often we think about him as supplying a kind of universal theory of humanity. Yeah, I mean, do you think that there is a sort of sense in which Freud's ideas aspired to be a general template rather than a historical moment? And he uses myth a lot, doesn't he?
Yes, of course he used myth, and he used... but I don't know, it's always dangerous when you kind of think of your ideas as being universal. And as we know nowadays from ethnography, from comparing different societies, many of the ideas we had in the West are actually fit for that particular epoch and for that particular situation. Of course, myth is something. I think myth is an important term, because myth is actually, it's not an explanation. Explanations are always a bit tricky because they they imply that we really are in control of everything. I can explain how this chair is made. I know it, so I have power of the whole process of making the change. Myth has always one aspect of pointing to something which we don't really know, which is numinous, which is mysterious. So it's an explanation, but at the same time, it's just maybe a story which helps us to to see something which might be beyond understanding. When we have a story which kind of has some kind of points to some kind of other resource, that's what starts imagination. That's what gets us motivated. That's what makes us focused. And so it's understandable that we want to kind of talk negatively about myth, despise myth. It's just myth and so. But actually, when you look at society, it's full of myths. It's full of, fake, or a lot of fake news. It's just myths, where we don't know, is it true? Is it false? That's our existence. We are beings which cannot explain many things in the world, and the ones which are explainable implies actually that we reduce our scope of everything which we could experience.
How much you think that psychoanalysis, with its quasi-mystical aspects, was kind of pushed down by these medical and modern scientific accounts?
Now, the phenomenon is, as I mentioned, is that actually we human beings have a restricted view possibility from the mind on everything. But at the same time, we yearn for power, for influence and control. That's very important. We want to control the processes which we are which we're experiencing. And I think that's how it happened with behavioral psychology. They started to reduce actually the scope in what is considered psyche, in what is considered the influential factors. They just avoided it and were concentrating on what is palpable. And of course, then you can prove it. Then you can have evidence-based kind of facts. So, but actually, it's really a reductionism. And when you do a reductionistic way of just concentrating on that, you're of course easier, more acceptable in society, because this approach of Jung, which points to otherness, is something which doesn't match in the way the codes in societies go. When we society functions on competence and knowing things, this and that, and so we do it, and so and this. Well, who knows? It might tell me something. That's something which does not fit into the way human beings function in a distinct society. So that's why I think behavioral psychology, but it's a complete reduction. It's a reductionism, and it's actually sad, but it's a sign that the society became saturated, that the society became self-concerned just with themselves. This success of CBT or cognitive psychology.
Can I ask also where the body is in all this? Because obviously Freud offers an account of the mind, but so many of the things that, everybody knows about Freud, ideas like penis envy and anal retentiveness and so forth that are very, very physical and physically grounded. Does Freud see the drives that power us as originating in the body?
Yes, and I think we don't have to forget, hysterical symptoms were very important from Freud, in those days one fainted and so on. So that was actually the body language, the body which actually kind of related some kind of message, we tried to say something. So that was actually the start. Nowadays one talks about the subtle body, that actually a lot of realizations, a lot of indication of the what I would call otherness, other things which are around, actually use the body as a messenger. So we're not just in the brain up here in this grey matter, but the whole body, because the body is extremely complicated, and the whole nervous system goes through, it goes through the whole body, and it's not just in the brain. So there might be processes which actually then lead to that some kind of symptoms arise, that suddenly my knee starts to hurt or my stomach starts. So actually we should see the body as a way also to communicate some messages. And so, but also it's of course reality. A body is also something palpable. We have medicine and we have facts, so it's the same dilemma we've got in.
Yes. And did he see the traffic between body and mind, and subsequent psychoanalysts see the traffic between body and mind as being sort of two-way?
I think he saw that, yes, absolutely. From what I know from his cases, from the cases I'm acknowledged, he actually saw that. He actually acknowledged bodily symptoms and also treated bodily symptoms through speech therapy.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about Jung and the ways in which he comes to adapt and eventually contradict Freud?
Well, Jung is actually, first of all, he had a completely bit different background. One has to realize he was his father was a clergyman. He was actually interested in religion, and so he was actually had another scope. He grew up somewhere in a clergyman's house, and so the priest. So that I think is important to know. So his interest was more broad in culture and in maybe history. So that's one of the big differences. And Jung actually he thought that what Freud states is a bit reductive. Just the drive, sexuality, and so he thought, no, we're influenced in a much broader way. Broader meaning by whole culture, society. So societies also contain a lot of information about what is going on, and that's where so for him societies were based on myths, on symbols and myths, and so his view was that actually a bit broader, that we're all influenced by that. Freud would say we're influenced by sexual drives which are repressed and then express themselves through the body or whatever, and Jung would say, well, maybe we're also influenced by the myth which a whole society or group of people adheres to, and which are not being recognized. So that I think is a major difference.
So would you say in some sense Freud is a more individualistic thinker?
Yeah, I think he was more individualistic thinker. He was more actually conserved, in a kind of, well, we have this, he was more actually a product of Viennese society, oddly enough, but he's being Jewish, he's actually always an outsider, but at the same time he was kind of a very correct and sort of very and Jung was kind of floating around a bit. Jung also had in his life a lot of breakdowns, difficult periods, and and Freud was actually always kept his schedule very tight.
How did these differences in approach, as you see it, express themselves in the differing conceptions of the unconscious that Freud and Jung had?
Jung would kind of refer to archetypes, refer to mythology, mythological figures, and so in order to understand the individual. Freud did that too, but in a more structured way with the Oedipus, complex, and so he did that too, but he used it actually just as certain metaphors in order to understand the individual's challenge. Jung used it in a much broader way. He would kind of go on and talk about the myth of Persephone or so, in order to understand some kind of psychic process. I think the danger is that you might get lost. Suddenly just talk about mythology and not the individual. But I think that's one of the major differences.
When did they decisively break from each other and go in their separate directions?
They traveled to America in order to have a lecture tour together, and on the boat, apparently, when they went from, to, I don't know, New York or so, they shared their dreams. When they slept there in the berth, something, they shared their dreams. And then one morning, apparently, Freud told his dream, and then Jung started to ask questions. Well, this is this. And then apparently, but that's just one of the stories, apparently Freud said, ja, das würde meiner Würde nicht entsprechen. And he implicated, Freud was older than Jung, and so my position doesn't allow me to tell you this background of this dream. And according to this story, that was the moment where Jung thought he's not really dedicated to investigating the psyche. He's more interested in keeping his facade, his persona, his social role. That was one explanation, but there's others, of course.
How important and what effect did the First World War have on the development of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic thought?
I think that's a very important point, because, we tend to forget the mood or the atmosphere. But if you read reports, then, the end of the 19th century, everybody thought war's impossible. We we can travel, we can visit each other. Why? It's inconceivable. If if a German knows Paris, he would never be ready to attack France. So it was, the general mood was, we've abolished wars, we've abolished conflicts, great. And, this is, you could see, because it was tremendous development. And then this completely unexpected fiasco, this disastrous war, where hundreds of thousands of young men died, appeared. And I would say, one was flabbergasted. What is this? This is actually the ultimate catastrophe. We don't have to forget, Europe considered itself as the leading culture in the world. So we are the ones who achieved it at the climax. We are the ones who actually managed to, and it was a catastrophe. And I think this is important for the start of psychoanalysis, because that's when Freud and others, of course, started thinking, wait a minute, we forgot about something. We didn't see something. We didn't realize that. We have to restart. We have to think a bit deeper. Human beings are not just doing, what the goals human beings give themselves, the ideas, the explanations, we can't trust them. There's other motives around.
Is it too dramatic to say that moment concretized the end of this sort of Enlightenment project, this idea that human beings were rationally perfectible?
Probably, yes. I wouldn't know exactly, but it questions the Enlightenment project a lot, because in Enlightenment was actually the I was important, the mind, and so on. We got rid of superstition. Finally, we got rid of the influence of religion, of all these priests, and this actually abruptly got stopped.
So what did the word soul mean in Jung's worldview?
It's very interesting. The word soul is a word you're not allowed to use. Psychology abolished the word soul. In German, you're not allowed to say Seele, because it's kind of considered very religious and so. But actually what Jung was trying to do, he said, we have soul, which is something which kind of entails or implies forces which might be beyond our consciousness, which are difficult to grasp with mind. That's why you use soul. Soul is something which is not palpable, cannot be proven, but still has a very big influence on us. And in German, you can distinguish between Wirklichkeit and Realität. So Wirklichkeit, and in English, you just have reality. So he would say, soul is a reality, meaning Wirklichkeit, meaning that it influences us and it origins in anything, from the background, in the surrounding, in society, in collective myths. So that's what soul is. It might even have a religious effect on us. So it might change us, giving the feeling of this mysterious and it distinguished that from psyche. Psyche being something nowadays more kind of controllable. It's just in the body. So this distinction is important. But it's bizarre that the word soul, as a psychologist, you shouldn't use the word soul anymore. I do, but you shouldn't.
How much room did Jung see for there being the personal and the individual? What was the relationship between the individual subject and the tribal unconscious or the collective unconscious for Jung?
Jung actually tried to understand the personal through the collective. So he tried to figure out what forces, myths of the collective start to influence the personal, the goals, values, personality. But the danger was, of course, that then the collective became personal. And I think that's one of the biggest difficulties and fallacies which happened, that suddenly people saw themselves as God, as reincarnation of the archetypes. And I think that's a basic misunderstanding. I think that one should actually keep a kind of modesty. The archetypes are outside, not inside. And there, I think this is when in the later period of the 20th century, suddenly this individualism came in. We all live the archetypes. We are all great in some way. We are all in command. This is a complete misunderstanding. We have to keep modest according to the big myths, stories, and it's not about us. And you see it in many phenomena that people start, when there's a topic around, like traumatization through sexuality, for instance, then suddenly everybody says, well, I've also been traumatized, I experienced as a child. Oh, yeah. They start developing stories, mythological stories, out of their own background, instead of saying this is a myth. This has nothing to do with you. And of course one can construe some kind of story out of one's recollection. Everyone has been probably traumatized, or might have been ostracized or what. But these are stories, and this is the challenge we face nowadays. People take themselves too important. They become individualistic, and they actually incorporate them. They retell their myths and possess them and make them part of their own personal history, which is a complete misunderstanding.
It's what's sometimes now called main character syndrome.
Yeah.
Now, you talk about the rise of individualism in the late 20th century. Psychoanalysis hasn't gone away.
No.
But do you think it's been somewhat on the back foot in the later half, from the later half of the 20th century on? Have these ideas fallen in some sense into abeyance, not had the power they did?
I personally suspect that psychoanalysis will emerge again, because we've been living the last 20, 30 years in the age of individualism. You know, all this, we place too much importance to a child's story, and there actually psychoanalysis, the way I understand this, points to other motives, other backgrounds. So as we experience now, currently, you know, there's a great change in the mood. Especially Europe was actually was like a safe haven in the last 30 years. And now we're experiencing, wait a minute, not everything is so secure and plannable than we thought. And so I think there's a change here happening.
This is interesting what you were saying about the 1890s could have been said equally well of the 1990s.
Yeah.
Being convinced history was over.
1890s and 1990s are very similar in certain ways. You know, this kind of, what's the right word? This kind of seduction, this kind of enthralling, you know, getting completely kind of identifying with something and paying too much importance in individual. I mean, it's interesting when we went back to the beginning of the 19th century, 17th century, when you prayed, you weren't allowed to say I, because it was God. It was God's will, and not I. And the word I was considered as tricky, because you then put too much value in your own personality, in your own upbringing, in your own story. And this is what happened now. We became kind of, what we want to achieve is the personal goals, personal well-being, personal individuation. I'm very skeptical of this term, individuation. So why should we individuate? Maybe we should actually just abide to something which is greater. We as persons are not that important. What we say and think is a product of society. It's not just a product of our ingenious way of thinking. And so there's a lot of misunderstandings.
Thank you very much indeed.